Jake sank into the wooden chair on the porch, a cold beer in his hand, watching the sunlight glint off the babbling stream. The small creek, winding along the edge of his property, had been there for centuries before the housing development sprung up around it. It was the main reason Jake had bought the house 6 years ago. Jake wasn't the type for tightly controlled communities. His whole life was about wide open roads, the roar of a truck engine, and long days crisscrossing the country. He owned a small trucking company with 5 semi-trucks, hauling goods between states. For him, freedom was paramount. And this place, with its natural stream, green lawn, and shady trees, was where he could breathe without constraints. But the HOA thought differently. Jake's neighborhood, Willow Creek Estates, had a homeowners association, HOA, headed by Karen Whitmore. If there were an award for people who like to control the lives of others, Karen would be a top contender. Karen, around 50 years old, always wore stiff business suits despite never going to work, and constantly carried a folder as if she were running a major corporation, not a small group of residents. For her, the HOA wasn't just an organization, it was a kingdom, and she was the queen. Willow Creek Estates was advertised as an upscale community where everything had to be uniform and pristine. Karen and the HOA board maintained a series of absurd rules to ensure neighborhood aesthetics, from fence heights to mailbox colors. They once fined a neighbor of Jake's $500 for parking his work truck on the street overnight. Another family was required to repaint their front door because the shade of blue they chose didn't match the HOA-approved color palette. And now, Karen had set her sights on Jake. The trouble started when Jake received a letter from the HOA, printed on thick, fancy paper with an ornate logo, a clear sign it didn't contain good news. Dear Mr. Johnson, upon reviewing the condition of your property, we have found that the stream running along your rear property line does not align with the aesthetic standards of Willow Creek Estates. The uneven terrain may negatively impact the property values of the neighborhood. According to Clause 7.3 of the HOA regulations, we require you to implement one of the following options. Fill in the stream and level the area to create a harmonious landscape. Erect a fence at least 6 feet high to conceal the stream from public view. Please respond within 14 days. Failure to do so will result in the HOA taking necessary measures. Sincerely, Karen Whitmore, HOA President. Jake chuckled, thinking it was a joke. But when he called the HOA to clarify, Karen confirmed it was real. But this stream is natural. Jake protested. It's not on HOA land, it's mine. Yes, Karen replied coldly, but it affects the entire community, and that's why we have the right to require you to renovate it to meet our standards. Jake hung up, trying not to smash his phone. Jake ignored the letter. He wasn't going to fill in the stream, nor did he intend to build a tall fence blocking his favorite view. If the HOA thought they could force him to do so with a few lines of absurd regulations, they were mistaken. But the HOA didn't give up easily. 2 weeks later, a second notice appeared in Jake's mailbox, this time accompanied by a $1,000 fine for non-compliance with HOA regulations. This was followed by a meeting with the HOA board, where Karen and her group tried to convince him that keeping the stream would negatively affect the entire community. Jake stood up in the middle of the meeting, planted his hands on the table, and looked straight into Karen's eyes. This is my land, my stream. You have no right to force me to do anything. Karen smiled faintly, unfazed. We have more rights than you think, Mr. Johnson. Jake didn't know what that statement meant, but he found out soon enough, just a week later. One Saturday morning, Jake was awakened by the roar of engines and the sound of people talking outside. When he went out, he saw a group of workers erecting concrete slabs along the edge of the stream, blocking the water flow. What the hell are you doing? Jake yelled at the nearest worker. We were hired by the HOA to carry out landscaping work, the man replied. They said we had legal permits. Jake turned and rushed to find Karen. He found her standing a few meters away, arms crossed, watching the workers with a satisfied look. Karen! Jake roared. What the hell are you doing? Karen didn't flinch. We're just helping you do what the HOA requested. Since you wouldn't do it yourself, we had to do it for you. Jake clenched his fists, trying to control his anger. This is my land. But it affects the entire community, Karen repeated, her eyes cold. And the HOA has the right to protect the property values of the neighborhood. Jake knew he couldn't stop them right now. But he also knew one thing. This was the last straw. If the HOA thought they could bully him like this without consequences, they were wrong. Very, very wrong. And Jake would show them what real consequences looked like. Jake wasn't surprised when the next letter from the HOA appeared in his mailbox the following morning. Dear Mr. Johnson, we regret to inform you that you continue to violate the regulations of Willow Creek Estates. Due to your failure to make the appropriate adjustments to the stream on your property, you are now being fined $2,500. This amount must be paid within 30 days. Failure to do so will result in the HOA taking further legal action. Sincerely, Karen Whitmore, President. Jake crumpled the paper in his hand. He had never hated the HOA this much. He knew the HOA had the power to impose fines, but $2,500 was completely unreasonable. He checked the HOA contract he had signed when he bought the house, something he had never paid much attention to before, and realized one thing. The HOA had the right to impose financial penalties if a resident affected the aesthetic uniformity of the neighborhood. A clause so vague they could twist it in any way that benefited them. Jake wouldn't accept this. He drove to the HOA office, where Karen and a group of board members were meeting. Karen, we need to talk. Karen looked at him smugly. About the fine? I thought I made it clear. This is my land. The stream doesn't violate any laws. You can't just make up some nonsense reason to fine me. As I said, Karen shrugged, the stream affects the property values of the area. If you don't follow the rules, there will be consequences. Jake gritted his teeth. What consequences? Karen smiled knowingly. Just wait and see. Jake started to feel that something was wrong when he noticed a group of workers lingering around his property the following week. One morning, as he stepped outside, he saw a large truck parked near the boundary of his land. On the truck, dozens of sandbags were stacked on top of each other, along with large concrete slabs. Jake rushed over and stopped one of the workers. What are you doing here? Enhancing the landscape at the request of the HOA, the man replied, pointing at a stack of documents. Jake snatched it and skimmed through it. It was a contract between the HOA and a construction company, hiring them to improve the neighborhood's aesthetics by controlling the natural water flow. Controlling the natural water flow? You mean blocking my creek? The worker shrugged. We're just following the contract. Jake turned to see Karen, who had just arrived with a satisfied smile. Karen, Jake roared. What do you think you're doing? Just maintaining the neighborhood standards, Mr. Johnson, Karen replied smoothly. Jake glared as the workers began stacking sandbags along the creek. Others were mixing cement, preparing to pour concrete to block the water. This is my land, Jake shouted. But the HOA has the right to intervene if something affects the entire community, Karen said nonchalantly. Jake felt his blood boiling. He wanted to storm in and stop them, but if he did, he could be sued for obstructing a legal project commissioned by the HOA. By the end of the day, as the workers finished their job, Jake could only watch helplessly as his creek was completely blocked. The water was cut off, starting to pool and flood his land. Jake wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. He knew he needed a strategy. He drove straight to the office of Mark Reynolds, a lawyer he had met back when he was a long-haul trucker. Mark specialized in civil disputes and had experience dealing with HOAs. Tell me the whole story, Mark said, opening a notebook. Jake laid everything out, the first warning letter, the escalating fines, and finally, the HOA blocking the creek on his land. Mark was silent for a moment. Here's the issue. When you bought your home, you signed an agreement accepting the HOA's regulations. And from what I see, they're exploiting a vague clause about uniform landscaping to push their agenda. So, can I sue them? Jake asked, hoping for a legal solution. You can, Mark replied, but it won't be easy. We could argue that the HOA has no right to alter natural features on private property, but this could take months, maybe even a year. Meanwhile, they can keep fining you. Jake clenched his fists. Isn't there a faster way? You could try rallying support from other residents, Mark suggested. If enough people oppose this, we can pressure the HOA into backing down. Jake nodded. It was worth a shot. But when he tried talking to his neighbors the next day, the response was disappointing. Some avoided the conversation altogether, afraid of getting into trouble with the HOA. Others were sympathetic but unwilling to take a stand, fearing they'd be punished like Jake. Only one man, an older resident named Richard, dared to speak his mind. "Jake, I'm on your side," Richard said. "But I've lived here long enough to know that Karen won't stop. She's pushed plenty of people into debt with her ridiculous fines." Jake realized that the HOA wasn't just an organization, it was a power machine, and Karen was the one pulling all the strings. But if Karen thought he would bow down and accept defeat, she was dead wrong. Jake was a trucker. He knew how to move tons of cargo across the country. He knew how to organize things efficiently. And most importantly, he knew how to strike back. If the HOA wanted a war, he would show them what a real war looked like. Jake couldn't let the HOA push him around any longer. After thinking through the night, he realized something crucial. The HOA didn't actually care about fairness or the rules. What they feared most was losing power and reputation. Karen and the HOA board prided themselves on making Willow Creek Estates look like an upscale community, neatly trimmed lawns, pristine streets, and nothing unsightly that might lower property values. If anything disrupted that image, the HOA would panic instantly. Jake knew he couldn't beat them in court, at least not quickly. But he could make them feel the same frustration they had forced onto him. And he knew exactly how to do it. As a seasoned trucker, Jake understood the power of these massive machines. A few well-placed trucks could completely block off a street. If he could gather enough, he could turn the HOA's life into a nightmare. He smirked to himself. The real game was about to begin. Jake pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and called Tom, an old friend he had worked with for years. "Tom, I need a little help." Tom chuckled. "You in trouble again? Need me to pull your truck out of a ditch?" "This time, it's even better," Jake replied. "The HOA in my neighborhood has gone too far. I want to teach them a lesson." The moment Tom heard "HOA," he got serious. "Damn HOA? I had my own run-in with them back in Florida. What do you need?" "Trucks. As many as possible." Tom didn't need any more explanation. "Give me a day. I'll call some guys." Jake didn't stop there. He reached out to Danny, Mike, and Rob, long-haul truckers he had met on the road. Each of them had their own bitter experiences with HOAs in different neighborhoods. Block off their precious little community? Danny laughed over the phone. "I like this plan. Count me in. I'll bring some friends." Within 24 hours, Jake had rallied more than 10 heavy-duty trucks. Not only that, but some of the drivers even volunteered to stay as long as needed, ready to move their trucks around to increase the chaos. The HOA siege was officially underway. Early the next morning, just as the sun began to rise, a convoy of semi-trucks slowly rolled into Willow Creek Estates. #### 7:00 a.m. The first trucks arrived, parking along the main road. ###8:00 a.m. One truck blocked the driveway in front of Karen's house. Another parked right in front of the HOA office. ###9:00 a.m. Almost every major street in the neighborhood had at least one truck parked on it. The placement was strategic. Main roads were slowed down, making it difficult for residents to get in and out. Smaller streets were nearly gridlocked. Driveways of key HOA members, especially Karen's, were completely blocked. At first, the residents didn't pay much attention. But within an hour, chaos erupted across the neighborhood. Luxury SUVs were trapped, unable to leave for work. Traffic inside the community slowed to a crawl, with long lines of frustrated drivers trying to find a way out. Karen stormed out of her house, eyes blazing with fury as she stared at the trucks blocking her driveway. Jake stood casually, arms crossed, leaning against his truck with a cold smirk. Karen stomped toward him, her face red with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Jake?" "Just parking on a public road," Jake said coolly. "Last I checked, there's no rule against it, right? This is harassment." Karen shrieked. I'm calling the cops. Oh, be my guest, Jake shrugged. But all of these trucks are legally parked. No one's breaking any laws. Karen clenched her fists. She knew he was right. The police couldn't do anything if the trucks weren't violating any parking regulations. Meanwhile, residents began complaining to the HOA. Karen, do something, a middle-aged man shouted. I can't take my kids to school because the roads are blocked. We need an emergency HOA meeting, now, another board member demanded. Karen bit her lip. She was starting to feel the full force of the chaos Jake had unleashed. Jake smirked, arms still crossed. The game had only just begun. Karen woke up the next morning with a pounding headache. She had spent the entire night answering dozens of calls from residents in the neighborhood. Everyone was furious about the congestion caused by Jake's trucks. Some parents couldn't get their kids to school on time. Others were stuck in traffic while trying to get to work. An elderly resident was especially angry because an ambulance had difficulty reaching his home. Karen, you need to do something right now, a neighbor snapped as she stepped out of her house. We can't live like this. Karen gritted her teeth. She couldn't let this continue. Without hesitation, she called the police. 30 minutes later, a police car arrived. Karen crossed her arms, standing beside the officer as they approached Jake. Arrest him for public disturbance, she ordered. The officer, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache, looked over at Jake, who was casually leaning against his truck, sipping a cup of coffee, looking completely relaxed. Can you explain what's going on here? The officer asked. Jake shrugged. We're just parking on a public road. Everyone has the right to park here, don't they? The officer frowned and inspected the trucks. Every single one was parked legally, not blocking driveways or violating any traffic laws. He's causing a disturbance. Karen shouted. Do something. The officer sighed. Ma'am, if they're not breaking any laws, there's nothing we can do. Karen's eyes burned with rage, nearly ready to explode. Jake had planned everything too well. Jake knew he needed a decisive blow to force the HOA to back down. So while Karen was desperately trying to find a solution, he emailed several local reporters and posted his story on social media. Jake's Twitter post headline: Luxury neighborhood crushed by a tyrannical HOA. They even blocked my stream. The post quickly went viral. His story gained massive support from internet users, with thousands of comments condemning the HOA, calling their actions absurd, abusive, and insane. In less than 24 hours, several local news outlets started covering the story. Resident fights back against HOA overreach. A trucker strikes back in an unexpected way. What's happening at Willow Creek Estates? Reporters flooded into the neighborhood, questioning residents. Some supported the HOA, but most were furious that Karen had caused this situation in the first place. One journalist even uncovered documents proving that the HOA had blocked Jake's stream, confirming that they had interfered with his private property without clear legal grounds. Karen was more desperate than ever. She wasn't just dealing with angry residents anymore. The media was all over her. Karen began to realize she couldn't keep this up any longer. 3 days after the truck blockade began, Karen called an emergency meeting with the HOA board. This has to end now, one member said. We're being ridiculed nationwide. But how do we get him to stop? Karen snapped. Jake won't listen. Then negotiate, another person suggested. Karen clenched her fists. Negotiating with Jake? That would be admitting defeat, But she had no other choice. The next morning, Karen went to see Jake. He was sitting on the wooden bench in front of his house, sipping coffee as if none of this concerned him. Jake, Karen said, trying to keep her voice calm. We need to talk. Jake looked up at her, smirking. Oh, now you want to talk? What about all the times I tried to negotiate before? Karen gritted her teeth but forced herself to stay composed. We have an offer. If you move the trucks, the HOA will cut your fines in half and allow you to keep the stream, as long as you build a small fence to hide it. Jake stared at her for a moment, then chuckled. Karen, do you think I'm stupid? Karen tightened her fists. Then what do you want? Jake set his coffee cup down, leaned back in his chair and spoke slowly. I want you to remove everything the HOA placed on my stream. Completely. And I want a formal document from the HOA acknowledging that I have full rights to the stream on my property. Karen froze. If you do that, Jake continued, I'll have the trucks leave. If not. He raised an eyebrow. I could always call in a few dozen more. What do you think? Karen went pale. She knew she had lost. Jake had too much leverage. A few days after the failed negotiation with Jake, the neighborhood residents lost all patience with Karen. They were exhausted by the chaos caused by the HOA. They also started questioning why the HOA was putting so much effort into fighting a man who just wanted to keep his stream. Jake's story continued to spread online, and residents received growing support from outsiders. And so, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Over 80% of the residents attended, the highest turnout ever. Everyone wanted to have their say. Karen stepped onto the podium, trying to maintain her usual authoritative demeanor, but this time, no one clapped. Just as she began justifying her actions, a man raised his hand. Karen, we want to hold a vote to remove you as HOA president. A thunderous round of applause erupted across the room. Karen turned pale, but there was nothing she could do. The vote took place on the spot. When the results were announced, over 90% of the residents voted to remove Karen. Karen stood frozen, unable to believe that the power she had held for years had crumbled in mere minutes. She had been officially overthrown. The very next day, a newly elected HOA board took over, and their first action was to strike a deal with Jake. The HOA covered all costs to remove the dam blocking his stream. Several ridiculous regulations that Karen had imposed on the neighborhood were also abolished. Most importantly, Jake received an official document confirming his ownership and protection of the stream on his property. Jake stood by, watching as workers removed every sandbag and concrete block the HOA had placed over his stream. The water flowed freely once again. When the job was finished, Jake simply smiled and made a short phone call. Less than an hour later, every single truck drove away. The neighborhood streets were clear again, as if nothing had ever happened. But the residents would never forget this lesson. A few weeks later, Karen left the neighborhood. No one knew exactly where she went, but rumors spread that she was trying to join another HOA. Jake didn't care. He had done what needed to be done. Now, he was a hero in the community. Those who had once feared the HOA now realized they could stand up and fight back when oppressed. Jake's story continued to spread, reaching larger news outlets. Other neighborhoods began questioning how their own HOAs were being run. And so, a wave of change began to spread. Jake stood on his porch, gazing at the stream glistening under the sunlight, a small smile on his face. He had never been one to seek conflict. But sometimes, to uphold justice, you have to stand up and fight. Conclusion ***. This story is a powerful testament to smart resistance against abusive power. Jake didn't choose direct confrontation. Instead, he used the resources available to him, his trucks and his connections in the trucking industry, to put pressure on the HOA. Karen and the HOA paid the price for their overreach, not only by restoring the stream but also by losing their leadership positions. The community learned an important lesson. When people unite and speak up, they can bring about real change in their own environment. The story delivers a satisfying ending. The protagonist wins without breaking the law. The abusers of power are held accountable and the community becomes a better place. ###Key takeaway***. Sometimes, to defend what's right, you don't need brute force. You just need the right strategy and unwavering determination.